Ernan, some would say that if we discover intelligent alien life, it would totally undermine the Abrahamic religions. Judaism, Christianity, Islam would just fall into contradiction. Is this something that should threaten us? I mean, I'm personally very interested in the reality, the possible reality, and there's this looming threat that maybe in tomorrow's headline, aliens' voices discovered on some signal, and all Abrahamic religions disintegrate.
Well, many people have said that in the past. It's interesting, though, in a way, I should say by way of a quick preliminary, that ever since the 17th century, when the possibility of this kind first came to be seriously thought about, the world of Copernicus and the planets seemed to be more hospitable possibilities than was true before. One of the very interesting things is, and unexpected things is, that in the Christian tradition on this issue where it was mostly discussed, most people thought positively about it, not negatively. There were a few holdouts, like William Whewell, who was associated very strongly with Cambridge. But at the same time, the vast majority were hospitable. And the reason for that was that they felt that in a universe which is the work of a creator, that the presence of the human is such a wondrous thing to begin with that it would not be limited to one small part. That is, and that intuition has heightened greatly in recent years, because we now know the scale of the universe a great deal better than was even true, say, 30 or 40 years ago. It's a vast universe with, I mean, uncounted billions of suns like our own, so to speak. Now, the question is this: do we think of the human experiment as being a unique one-on-one thing? Now, as you say, the Abrahamic religions, the Western religions, tended to see God as touching a special history, our history, the history of earth, the history of Moses, the history of Muhammad, the history of Jesus. But of course, from that point of view, there is nothing, it seems to me, within that argues that has to be a unique feature of the story of earth. I think that the Christian has a bigger difficulty here than the others did. Moses and Muhammad can be, as it were, duplicated. There can be other Moseses and the other Muhammads appropriate to, but with Jesus there is an element of uniqueness that creates much of an issue of a different kind. On the other hand, it seems to me fairly clear that that God can lean into human histories where humans exist in other parts of the universe in the way in which Jesus did here, possibly in different ways. It would depend a great deal on the conditions of that universe, on the reality of sinfulness within it, for example, the way in which human freedom had been abused or not abused. And that could vary, I think, somewhat with even the physiological makeup of these different humans. There might be different situations like that. I see no reason, though, not to suppose that the story, as we see it on Earth, could in fact be duplicated in many other parts.
You brought up the problem of Jesus and the incarnation.
Yes.
Would this mean that could there be other incarnations?
Oh, yes.
Would that mean Jesus would have to live and die and be resurrected on multiple places?
Yes, that's a possibility.
That would not be inconsistent?
No, I don't see it. Now, mind you, there are texts in the Bible that would suggest, in the New Testament, that would suggest uniqueness there. But I would say that those texts were written at a time when the possibility even of life elsewhere simply didn't exist. I mean, people never thought of that.
I think there are two possibilities with the incarnation if one were believing in that. Yeah. Either that if there are many other races of beings, conscious beings that need salvation, that God has a special plan for that, either different. the sequence of incarnations and resurrections, deaths and resurrections, or some other process.
Yes.
Or in some way, that's part of Christian tradition, that Jesus living, dying, and being resurrection here is somehow sufficient once and for all time.
Yeah, this is stretching into areas that we simply have to tread very warily. We really don't know firm answers to questions like that. I just give you my own instinctive answer, so to speak. I think the idea of the traditional idea, I suppose, of the life of Jesus, and especially the death of Jesus, as enveloping the entire universe in the event of there being multiple races of humans elsewhere in the universe, I think it's most unlikely. And it's most unlikely for several reasons. But one reason is, how would they know about it? They would never, I mean, do you send out some sort of extraterrestrial telegraph to say the good news is here? It just raises all kinds of implausibilities. But what's very crucial, I think, within the story of the Christian story is that God took on our humanity. He had our chromosomes. I mean, he had the same kind of chromosomes as we have. He was part of an evolutionary story that began 4 billion years ago, or even further. I mean, not only was he redeeming the human, he was redeeming the whole creation within which there was a development towards free action. A whole creation, so to speak, within the earth, within the story of the earth, was raised up by God's, as it were, sanctifying human history by his presence within it, by not only by living within it, but by dying within it, and in that sense showing that somehow suffering is part of being human, that being human is to make oneself subject to suffering, and in some sense showing that for God to become human meant to accept the conditions of humanity, which, and in this particular case, the terrible death that went with it. So, but that's so peculiar to the human story that I must say I cannot believe that action within our story would be, as it were, all sufficient to answer the same question all over the universe if such questions arise elsewhere in the universe. I would therefore argue very strongly in favor of the other alternative, that if on some distant planet at some time there is a human race that is a race with the powers of freedom and imagination and spirit that we have, or something akin to that, if there are races of that kind within which freedom can be abused as we abuse it, then in fact God could lean into that history in the same way as he has done here.
And if that were to be true, that wouldn't shake your faith?
It would be great news. It would be good news. I mean, it would be interesting news in the sense of saying, well, okay, can you tell us more about how you understand this, that we might learn something? I mean, we have to not be too smug about this. I mean, we don't, there is a temptation to take the sacred story of the Torah or the Quran or the Bible, the New Testament, to take that as a kind of a final story. It's not a final story. I mean, we're still developing our understanding of that, as a matter of fact, of those stories to a very great extent. And therefore, one possible development, I mean, I've often reflected that science itself, our own science, has already enlarged the Christian story. Finding by extraterrestrial messages, we'll never visit, nor will they ever visit us. I mean, that science fiction travel I rule out, actually, but that's another story. But communication is possible. And if we if the SETI project were to work out, and we do get a message from elsewhere, and if we could decipher it, which I have some doubts about, then, in fact, we could learn something, and we could learn something religious. Many science fiction people have speculated that, and I think there's nothing wrong with that at all. I mean, If God has touched their history in a way different from ours, we should know about that. We could learn from it. But I don't see a threat. I don't see a threat at all. I see an enlargement, just as the enlargement of our understanding of our own universe has enriched our theological, our religious insights. They're capable, surely, of further enlargement.